Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Part 69: The Language as a Living Grammar. Remember the language we are learning together. There is one field, phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once: time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and the motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we focus on just one of those echoes. We have climbed very high in Episode 7. We started from the roots of the master tree and slowly made our way upwards to its highest visible branches. We learned the alphabet of this language, phi itself as the silent root, omega as the rhythm of time, k as the texture of space, d phi as direct change, and v as motion braided from omega and k. We built echo towers, linking temporal, spatial, and kinematic shadows floor by floor. We cleared philosophical trapdoors that could confuse or mislead. We allowed the model to be cross-examined by expert voices. We discovered its self-similarity and saw how the pattern of derivatives repeats across levels. We then learned semantic compression, the art of hearing the essence of the story in the first few layers of the tree. And we explored hierarchical predictive power, the ladder that lets us move from what is to what will be. Yet up to now, you might still see this language as something frozen, like a printed dictionary or a static codebook. Today, we dissolve that picture. Today, we meet the Holophase language as a living grammar. When we talk about a living grammar, we shift from thinking about symbols on a page to thinking about speech in action. A grammar book sitting on a shelf can be rich and complete, but by itself, it is silent. It only becomes alive when someone uses it to speak, to write, to sing, to improvise. The rules remain the same, but their application creates something new each time. From a small set of grammatical rules, a child, a poet, or a community can create novels, laws, jokes, prayers, and whispers that have never been said before. The miracle is that a finite rule set can generate an infinite variety of meaningful sentences. The holophase language operates in exactly this way. The derivative operators and the basic variables are like a finite alphabet. The constraint chains, the equations that relate these derivatives and fields, are like grammatical rules. But the actual universe we see around us is not a list of all possible allowed sentences written in advance. It is the live performance of those rules, generating new sentences moment by moment. A star is not a static entry in a catalog. It is a long, burning sentence in the language of phi. A hurricane is a sentence. A nerve impulse is a sentence. The orbit of a planet, the growth of a plant, the unfolding of a thought, all of these are specific, one-time expressions of the living grammar. This is what we mean when we say the holophase is generative. The rules are fixed at a deep level, but their application is open-ended. There is no master library where every possible configuration of phi is stored and then replayed. Instead, there is one continuous field and one family of grammatical rules, and together they generate the universe in real time. The possible is far larger than the actual, and the actual is a tiny stream chosen out of an almost unimaginable ocean of sentences that could have been spoken but never are. The triunity of time, space, and motion shows up here as the stage on which this grammar performs. Each new sentence written in phi has three linked aspects. There is a temporal echo, the particular rhythm with which the configuration unfolds, slows, speeds up, stops, or repeats. There is a spatial echo, the shape, distribution, and arrangement through which the configuration expresses itself. There is a kinematic echo, the flows, velocities, and accelerations that carry the configuration from place to place. A newly formed star has a time history, a spatial structure, and a pattern of motion in its plasma and its surrounding gas. A migrating bird has a timed sequence of flights and pauses, a path traced across the geography of the Earth, and a pattern of velocities influenced by air currents and internal drives. Each is a full triune sentence spoken by the same grammar. To feel how this language is not only generative but adaptive, consider how a living system shifts modes when conditions change. Think of water. At low temperatures, the molecules arrange themselves in a crystalline lattice. The derivatives of the underlying field reflect rigidity, fixed neighbors, small oscillations around stable positions. As energy is added, those derivatives change. At the melting point, the system undergoes a phase transition. The same molecules now explore a different branch of the derivative tree. They slip and slide past one another, forming a liquid. The grammar has not changed at the deepest level, but the active sentence structure has shifted. If we heat further, the system moves into the gas phase, where the derivatives tell a story of free flight, rapid collision, and expansion. Solid, liquid, and gas are like distinct dialects within one language, all generated by the same living grammar, responding to different boundary conditions and energy tallies. The same pattern appears in nuance. A neuron at rest speaks a quiet sentence where voltage and ion channel states sit near equilibrium. When input reaches a critical threshold, the system jumps to a different grammatical branch. Membrane potential races upward, falls back, overshoots, and slowly recovers. This action potential is a carefully shaped phrase, generated by the same local rules applied in a different region of the derivative space. After firing, the neuron enters a refractory state, another grammatical mood in which the rules favor silence until the system is ready to speak again. All of this is the holophase grammar at work, adapting its active branch to context without ever changing its fundamental logic. You can see this too in economies and ecologies. An economy in stable growth speaks one dialect of its grammar. Most derivatives of prices, production, and employment are modest and predictable. When shocks arrive, such as sudden policy changes or shortages, the system may shift into a new branch where some derivatives grow large and trends reverse. Recession, recovery, boom, and bust are different sentences generated by the same underlying constraints and feedbacks. In an ecosystem, a stable forest has one grammar of flows and populations. A disturbed forest after a fire has another, a recovering forest yet another. Species composition, nutrient cycles, and energy flows move through sequences of sentences, each one changing the conditions for the next. This brings us to one of the most powerful aspects of the living grammar: feedback. In ordinary language, what you say can change the situation, and that new situation shapes what can be said next. A question invites an answer. A promise creates an obligation. A story told over years can reshape relationships and institutions. The output of speech becomes input for new speech. In the holophase, the same pattern runs deep. The state of phi at one time and the patterns of its derivatives constrain how phi can change next. But those changes themselves alter the derivatives and thus modify the constraints that will apply in the future. In general relativity, the distribution of energy and momentum, which is a particular derivative expression of underlying fields, tells spacetime how to curve. That curvature then tells energy and matter how to move, feeding back into the distribution. In biology, gene expression creates proteins which regulate future expression. In neural tissue, firing patterns change synaptic strengths, which in turn change the likelihood of future firing patterns. In each case, what the grammar has already written conditions what it can write next. The language writes its own context. From the perspective of the holophase model, many of the phenomena we call emergence are simply the living grammar playing out its feedback loops over long periods and across many levels of the derivative tree. A flock of birds wheeling in the sky emerges from simple local rules about alignment, attraction, and separation applied iteratively in time. The global pattern is not added from the outside. It is generated by repeated application of a small set of derivative-based constraints. A traffic jam emerges from the local driving rules of individual cars and their accelerations and decelerations. The jam is a sentence spoken by the grammar of drivers, roads, and reaction times. This view extends outward into cosmology and inward into microscopic physics. In the early universe, tiny quantum fluctuations in a nearly uniform field acted as phonemes, the smallest variations in phi. Gravity, acting as a constraint chain on those variations, amplified some, damped others, and over billions of years produced the great web of galaxies and voids we observe today. The cosmic microwave background is like a faint imprint of an early stanza of the universal sentence. The large-scale structure of the universe is a later, more elaborate chapter. All of it is generated by a living grammar, working through feedback and derivative relations. We can recognize a similar pattern in our human world of culture and meaning. The set of norms, laws, values, and shared stories in a society forms a kind of social grammar. It does not force specific events, but it shapes what kinds of events are likely, what kinds of actions are praised or punished, and how people expect others to respond. When conditions change, that social grammar can itself evolve. New technologies, new ideas, and new forms of communication feed back into the rules of interaction, gradually shifting expectations and possibilities. A revolution in thought or politics is a moment when a society explores a very different branch of its own master tree. Old structures may collapse, and new ones may crystallize. But the process is still grammatical in the sense that local interactions and derivative changes in opinion, trust, and power generate the global outcome. So, how do we recognize this living grammar when we look out at the world? First, we look for novelty within stability. A system with a living grammar produces new patterns under the guidance of consistent rules. Think of a game of chess. The rules are fixed, but each game is different. In fluids, the equations of motion are fixed, but each storm has its own unique shape and path. Second, we look for phase shifts, the moments when the system moves from one macro behavior to another. Solid to liquid, laminar flow to turbulence, peace to war, stability to unrest. All of these are signs of a grammar exploring different branches under new conditions. Third, we look for feedback loops, where the outputs of the system become inputs that strengthen or weaken the very processes that created them. Fourth, we look for emergence, where coherent structures appear at large scales from simple interactions at small scales. The Holophase framework makes a bold and testable claim. It says that the creative, adaptive, feedback-driven behavior of physical systems can be derived from local constraint chains acting on a continuous field. Everything that looks like a living grammar, from fluid turbulence to cardiac rhythms to chemical oscillations, should be reproducible, in principle, by making the right choice of phi and the right set of derivative relations. This is not a mystical statement. It is an invitation to model and to test. If we find a reproducible phenomenon that cannot be captured by any field-based, derivative-based grammar, no matter how clever and detailed, that would signal a genuine limitation of the Holophase vision and would force us to expand or revise our understanding. At the same time, the living grammar viewpoint gives us a more unified way to think about stability and change. Stable regimes, such as a climate that fluctuates within a certain range, or a heartbeat that stays within healthy limits, correspond to attractors in the grammar. The system speaks variations of the same dialect. Transitions between attractors, such as tipping points in climate or sudden arrhythmias in the heart, correspond to moves between branches of the tree. Prediction is harder there, because small influences can send the system one way or another. But even this difficulty can be understood within the language. It is the nature of grammars with feedback and nonlinearity to have regions where small differences in initial phrasing lead to large differences in the later story. Where does phi fit in all this? It remains the one field, the single continuous substance that carries everything we have described. The living grammar is not something separate from phi. It is the pattern of relationships among phi and its derivatives. The field and the grammar are two sides of the same coin. One is the material that moves, and the other is the logic that relates its movements. When we say the universe is speaking itself into existence, we mean that phi, obeying its own derivative-based constraints, generates the sequence of states we call reality. There is no external narrator. The narration is written from within. As we step back and look at our journey through Ep.7, we can now see how everything fits together. We began by insisting that the language of reality is built from phi and its derivatives, and that time, space, and motion are three simultaneous shadows of this single process of change. We built echo towers to keep those shadows aligned. We learned to read the master tree, not as a pile of disconnected symbols, but as a structured hierarchy of questions about phi. We cleared misunderstandings, faced hard questions, and carved out clear paths to test and to falsify the ideas. We discovered self-similarity in the tree structure, which allowed us to learn one pattern and view it at many levels. We discovered semantic compression, which allowed us to hear the essence in a simplified model while remembering the deeper richness behind it. We discovered hierarchical predictive power, which showed us how to climb the tree step by step to say something honest about the future. And now, in this part, we have seen that the whole structure is not dead, but alive. It is a living grammar, able to generate, adapt, and respond. To close, imagine once more a great improvising musician standing before an audience. They know their scales and chords inside out. They know the theory, the rules of harmony and rhythm. Yet, when they play, they do not recite a memorized list of pieces. They let the moment, the room, and their own feeling guide which notes to choose next. The rules are folded into their muscles and nerves. Each phrase they play creates a new context for the next phrase. Themes appear, develop, and resolve. Surprises occur, but never violations of the underlying musical logic. The performance is coherent, alive, and unrepeatable. The universe is that musician at a level we can barely imagine. Phi is the instrument and the sound at once. The Holophase grammar is the deep musical knowledge, the unspoken structure that makes the performance possible. Galaxies, storms, animals, minds, and societies are phrases and motifs, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, always part of a larger, evolving composition. To study the holophase is to try to hear that music more clearly, to recognize its motifs, to understand how new songs can grow from the same few notes and rules. In the final part of this chapter, we will take this idea to its broadest horizon. We will ask whether this living grammar, born from one field and its derivatives, can in principle speak about anything: physics, life, society, and mind. We will explore how far the holophase language can reach as a universal grammar of existence, and we will invite you to feel, not just think, what it means to live as a small but real sentence inside this vast, unfolding story. Before we finish, I want to bring this down to a very personal scale, so you can feel this living grammar at work inside your own life. Think about a single day. You wake up, you move through routines, you face surprises, you make choices. From the holophase perspective, your day is a continuous sentence written in the field of your body and your environment. Your brain activity, muscle contractions, breathing patterns, heartbeats, and tiny adjustments of posture and attention are all expressions of phi and its derivatives. The rules of physiology, psychology, and social interaction are the constraint chains, the grammatical rules shaping what is possible next. Yet within those rules, you have enormous room for creativity. You can respond with kindness or anger, with patience or impatience, with curiosity or indifference. Each response slightly reshapes the conditions that tomorrow's sentence will inherit. When you form a habit, you are effectively installing a small grammar inside yourself. A habit is a constraint chain that says, when this situation appears, respond in this way. Over time, sequences of habits build patterns of life. Some habits simplify the grammar of your days, making behavior more predictable and less flexible. Other habits, like deliberate reflection, study, and compassion, may open new branches in your personal tree, allowing more creative responses. Seen in this way, self-development is not magic. It is the slow rewriting of the constraint chains that govern your own micro version of phi. You are teaching your nervous system to speak different sentences within the same living language. You can also use this lens when you look at technology and culture. A new technology, like the printing press or the internet, is not just a device. It is a new operator in the social grammar, a new way for information and influence to propagate, a new derivative that mixes time, space, and motion in a fresh pattern. Once it appears, it changes which sentences are easy or hard for a society to say. A culture with writing can stabilize laws, preserve memories, and coordinate across generations in ways that a purely oral culture cannot. A culture with global, instant communication can generate financial storms, viral ideas, and new forms of collaboration and conflict. Each step in technological change is a shift in the effective grammar through which humanity speaks its collective sentence. At a deeper philosophical level, the idea of a living grammar invites a different attitude to uncertainty and control. If the universe were a static code, fully specified and fixed from the beginning, then everything would be either rigidly determined or random noise added on top. In a living grammar, the future is not determined in detail, but neither is it arbitrary. It is shaped by the interplay between rules and context, between constraints and feedback, between derivative structure and initial and boundary conditions. This means that genuine novelty can appear without violating the underlying consistency of the system. Stars that never existed before can form, species that never existed before can evolve, thoughts that never existed before can be thought. All of these are new sentences that respect the grammar. For you as a listener, this has an important emotional and existential implication. It means you are neither a powerless speck tossed around by impersonal laws, nor a detached ghost hovering above a meaningless machine. You are a local, finite, but real center of grammar in action. Your choices, your attention, your efforts are small edits in the ongoing sentence of phi at the place and time you occupy. They are constrained by biology, history, and physics, but they are not empty. The living grammar multiplies possibilities, and your life is one narrow path chosen through that branching space. Notice also how this view reframes the idea of understanding itself. To understand something deeply is not only to memorize its parts, but to internalize its grammar so well that you can predict, improvise, and translate. A good engineer can not only recite equations, but can foresee how a structure will respond to different loads. A good musician can not only play scales, but can improvise new melodies that still sound like the same raga or mode. A good friend can not only remember facts about you, but can anticipate how you are likely to feel or react in different situations. In each case, real understanding is grammatical understanding. It is fluency in the living pattern of change. The Holophase framework suggests that the greatest scientific and philosophical task of our time is to learn the living grammar of reality itself. This does not mean mastering every detail. It means learning the deep, repeating structures of the derivative tree and how they manifest as time, space, and motion across scales. It means learning to recognize self-similarity, to use semantic compression wisely, to climb the predictive ladder when needed, and to step back when the system approaches a phase transition. It means learning to see feedback loops and emergent behaviors as natural expressions of a single underlying language instead of isolated miracles. As you listen to this series, you are already practicing this. Each part teaches you a new grammatical feature and then shows you that same feature in many different domains. You begin to feel that a wave in water, a pulse in neurons, a pattern in galaxies, and a trend in society are all different stories written in the same script. You start to trust that when you encounter a new complex phenomenon, you can ask, where is the time echo? Where is the space echo? Where is the motion echo? And how do they relate through derivatives? That simple habit of questioning is the beginning of thinking in the holophase language. One of the most beautiful consequences of this perspective is that science and meaning stop being enemies. If reality is a living grammar, then scientific laws are not cold external chains, but the deep syntax of a creative process. They are the rules that make meaning possible. The formation of a star is not less wondrous because we understand the equations of nuclear fusion and gravity. It is more wondrous because we can see how a small set of rules can generate such a luminous, stable, long-lasting sentence of light and heat. Likewise, understanding the neural dynamics behind the feeling does not erase the feeling. It shows how rich the grammar must be to support such subtle and layered experiences. Of course, this view is still a hypothesis, still a proposal. The Holophase model must face experiments, simulations, and critical debate. It must earn its place by explaining phenomena more simply, more unifyingly, or more fruitfully than alternative pictures. That is why, throughout this series, we have insisted on falsifiability, on convergence tests, on cross-examination by physicists, mathematicians, linguists, and information theorists. A living grammar that cannot be challenged is not science, it is dogma. A living grammar that invites challenge and survives it becomes a tool, a bridge, and perhaps one day a new normal in how we think about reality. For now, what matters is that you have a mental and emotional handle on this idea. When you hear the phrase, the language as a living grammar, you can picture a tree of derivatives that is not frozen, but growing, branching, and flowering. You can imagine phi not as a static quantity, but as a musician playing, a river flowing, a story being told. You can feel yourself, your body, your relationships, and your projects as small but real phrases in that story. And you can carry this intuition into whatever field you care about, whether that is physics or art, ecology or education, spiritual practice or social change. If you work in science, you might ask how your field's current models fit into this larger grammatical picture. If you work with people, you might ask how patterns of behavior reflect deeper feedback loops and derivative structures. If you are simply living your life, you might ask how your habits, hopes, and fears reflect the sentences you have been trained to speak, and what small grammatical shifts might open new space for healing and growth. In this way, the holophase language stops being just an abstract theory and becomes a way of seeing. It becomes a new pair of glasses through which the patterns of the world come into sharper focus. It becomes a quiet, continuous reminder that behind every event, every form, and every movement, there is one field, changing with a deep, coherent, living logic. And as you grow more fluent, that logic becomes a companion, helping you navigate the mystery with a bit more clarity, humility, and awe. This view is quietly empowering. Salam, and peace be upon you.